Good evening, or good morning. Actually, it's good morning on Wednesday morning. And this is John Bushka, and that's a picture of downtown Minneapolis from the East Bank. And that's the hidden by the tree, kind of. That's the Churchill Apartments where I lived for 6 years on the river. Very nice time, 1997 to 2003. Um, And I wanted, to talk today again about the age verification issue and particularly and now the issue about VPNs and about anonymity. And I want to just go back to recalling um, that time when I was starting in Minneapolis after I published my first book, um, and when desktop publishing was making it feasible for people to self-publish, but moreover, right around 1996 and 1997, it was becoming feasible for people to um, put their own content, their own text content on the internet and be found by search engines for free, mostly Google. They didn't really have to pay for that. And my ideas about, intimate, how forced intimacy and a dorm in the early 1960s corresponded to forced intimacy in the barracks in the 1990s. We're debating on gays in the military then kind of took hold that way and became known and became effective. As we know that policy was finally repealed in 2011, and then technically the appeal still stands today, although not for trans. But so I was very effective with that. Um, we also know that there was a Communications Decency Act which tried to censor the internet to protect children, and the censorship portion was thrown out, but the portion that allows platforms and web hosts to not have liability, generally speaking, for what users published, and that was extended later to social media companies. Section 230 did survive. That was very important for our be able to continue to self-publish on the internet over the years. And there was a challenge to it called they tried to reinvent the CDA sort of with a law called the Child Online Protection Act in 1998, COPA, not the thing was COPA, COPA, which was struck down finally in 2007 in a bench trial in Philadelphia that I actually went to one day after visiting the Supreme Court twice. So there's all of that in our background, which kind of left us uh, for many, many years being able to say what we wanted online. Gradually, in the later 2000s, in the 2010s, well, there was the expectation of anonymity that you could use the internet with identifying yourself was very important and taken for granted for a long time. And then, of course, the idea of virtual private networks and VPNs developed, and people started using those to protect themselves. And in the late after in the late 2010s, after Trump became president, after Charlottesville, it was actually the left started actually clamping down on most of the censorship for a while. Well, for a long time, and we started having problems with censorship and cancellation to some extent. Then we had the pandemic, and then we came out of the pandemic, the cancel culture problem, particularly on gender identity and transgenderism, became quite severe in some cases. So we all know what that history is. Um, Now there are a couple of bills in state legislatures I just wanted to share with you, and I'll just run through. First of all, here's a couple more pictures from Minnesota. That's a tunnel line, Route 61 north of Duluth. I kind of like that, and that's the Nanny Boozhoo Resort, northeast of Grand Marais on Highway 61, almost to Canada along Lake Superior. But here's a picture from Wisconsin, northern Wisconsin, not too far from Eau Claire. One of the bills is from Wisconsin. which I think, as I remember, passed the House and will likely have passed the Senate if I remember. It would require, as have many other states, age verification of some kind for harmful to minors content. It seemed to have expanded the definition of harmful to minors a bit. And I think there's an article in an Electronic Frontier Foundation that you can look at that I'll share with you. And get back to, I kind of lose my place with the pictures here. But there is there's also a provision in the Wisconsin law that if your site is harmful to minors, even if you do have age verification on it, you must block VPN uses in your state. That can be done by IP addresses, but generally web hosts don't make that very easy for ordinary websites to do. Big corporate websites do it because they want to protect their advertising revenue and so forth. There's also, I'll pass on to another state. That picture was in the late 90s, I think. That's Houghton, Michigan, on the Upper Peninsula. On a picture I took on a trip in 2019, in the fall of 2019, not too long before the pandemic started. There were probably signs it was already starting, but that's another story. And Michigan has what a proposed law, which may not be getting that popular, but there's what they call an Anti-Corruption and Public Morals Act. They apparently want to abolish the use of VPNs altogether for any sites, and then any site that has harmful to minors material as they define it, which is quite strict and which apparently includes presenting transgenderism in a favorable way, would be banned, would be illegal. And then one problem with laws like this, and it doesn't sound like this law is all that likely to go anywhere, whereas the Wisconsin law seems a lot more likely to pass, but it's not that popular. But the idea that somebody would even introduce it and get it as far as it's gotten is kind of scary. But the problem is that if you have a website, even like mine, out of state, like either my blog or my John W. Bushka site, either one of them out of site, and if it was determined to be harmful to minors, I could be prosecuted or sued, even though I'm not in the state. If a user in Michigan or Wisconsin or whatever state, because there are many other states that have laws like this. Now, generally, these laws still all have a provision that if more than 1/3 or more than 1/4 of the site is harmful to minors, and they're generally focusing on businesses. But it's only a matter of time before they could try to focus on sites that are more like mine. In a place like Hungary, and for example, in Orbán, my sites would probably be illegal without protection because in Hungary and some other countries, they think that children will be influenced not to want to marry and have children by material like mine. Of course, the left is always saying both homosexuality you're born with and that seems to be somewhat credible with the 8 birth order theory, and some of that seems to be pretty credible. And the idea that transgenderism, you have a gendered brain. I'm not going to get into that here, but that's scientifically a very dubious idea, and a lot of it has to do with changing language and changing gender identity doesn't mean the same thing as sex, and wanting to replace sex in our society with gender identity and so forth. That's another topic I've talked about before. But discussion of that on a website might be in a few states considered harmful to minors because it might be thought of as persuading minors to try, particularly social transitioning. There's a lot of evidence among teenage girls that, particularly in the early 2010s, that a lot of this was in social media. It was a social contagion, not an actual medical issue. And it's quite unclear, and a lot of things in the trans area still, to me, the way I look at it, are still rather unclear. Not completely clear of what's going on, even as to the medicine. So, and it's actually hard to research. It's hard to find good papers on it that aren't prejudiced or they're understandable. So that's kind of where we would be. So I just wanted to mention this. Also, I'm seeing a lot of sites, mostly legitimate periodical sites, that say you can sign on through Facebook or sign on through Google. And so what Google and Facebook are starting to do is their own kind of generic age verification. Some of it is with AI, and they're starting to do age verification that way. And so essentially anonymity is being lost. We could be heading toward a system where everybody has to have a digital ID that's used the basis for age verification. I'm going to be talking about that in my book that I'm hoping maybe to have it out by the end of March. I'm hoping to have it turned in completely by, say, President's Day. I haven't really talked about that. One of these things about these laws is that it affects you. It affects what you can say as a publisher, potentially, as a self-publisher, even if you don't have children yourself. If you didn't marry and have children yourself, you have to be mindful of protecting children. And it also affects your access to things you might want to watch, because a lot of things are not available anymore. Pornhub, it's pulled, its site from many states because it doesn't want to deal with this. So it affects what is an adult that I can access even in my own condo here when I'm alone as an adult, indirectly to protect the interests of those who are raising children. So the fact that we all have a responsibility for other generations, and there's a moral sense that we should accept that we have this kind of responsibility, starts to get some traction. I wound up having to be responsible for my mother in particularly between 1999 until she died in 2010. Filial responsibilities. That's although she had a lot of money, but I had to be very careful about her care and leaving her alone and that kind of thing. And I didn't have since I didn't have children of my own, I didn't have anyone to help me do it without hiring help. And of course, hiring help now might be compromised by ICE and the immigration issue. Although I'm quite sure everybody we hired was here legally. We had agencies checking and everything. I'm pretty sure everything we did was legal, but back in the 90s and the 2000s. But this is all very consuming, it's like, the title of my third book. Here it is. Speech is a fundamental right that being listened to is a privilege. Being able to have your work displayed. Let me. If one. Being able to have your work displayed, and this is the third book right here. Being able to have it available for others to find, like I did in the early part of the uh, 2010s, when I was back living here, back in this space, over 20 years ago, being able to do that isn't something I can assume as a fundamental right. I have to share some of the responsibility for the risk that it could pose to children. And again, there's a debate over whether people are born with, if children who are non-conforming to the expectations of their sex are born with that, which the left insists, or whether it's something they develop because of culture and what they're exposed to, which the right thinks. Still a big debate. The left is not willing to back down on the fact that you're born with everything you are. You are something, and the right is insisting on the idea that you do something rather than that you are something. And that's where we are. But so I just wanted to call this all to your attention this morning, and I do thank you for listening.